Gabriel Wildau is the Senior Vice President of Teneo Risk Advisory and joins us now from Hong Kong. Good of you to step by the studio there. Gabriel, is it fair to say that actually the only thing that's really changed in terms of the Chinese negotiating position is our expectations, that really the Chinese have pretty much stuck to what they've always said they would do or want to do since the May breakdown?
I think that's right. There's a huge gap in expectations between the two sides right now. And we saw Trump's comments yesterday to the effect that China wants to make a deal more than the U.S. And I think that's not just posturing on Trump's part. He really believes that. The problem is I think that's a misjudgment of the Chinese intentions. We've seen since May that their position is relatively clear. Since talks broke down, we've seen what they're willing to give and what they're not willing to give. My estimation is that the U.S. politics, rather than the Chinese position, is now the main variable and the main deciding factor in whether we're ultimately going to get a deal. Trump is looking at the election politics and making a judgment every day about, does he need to be tough on China today? Does he need to be a little bit more conciliatory in order to calm financial markets? And he's going to go through that exercise every day between now and the elections. And he'll eventually have to make a decision about whether he needs a deal before the election. But the Chinese side isn't really going to move, in my estimation.
How do you think the moves to try to impeach President Trump, if you say that the key variable here could be U.S. politics, so putting aside the election, which isn't till November 2020, right here, right now, efforts to try and impeach President Trump, how might that factor into the U.S.-China negotiations?
I think Beijing smells weakness with the impeachment inquiry, and it probably strengthens the conviction that they already had that Trump may not be a very reliable interlocutor, a very reliable negotiating partner, because the unpredictable politics of the U.S. could cause a situation where Trump agrees to some kind of relatively narrow deal, some kind of deal that the Chinese would be comfortable with, but then the political situation in the U.S. shifts, causing Trump to come back and demand for more, to say that actually we want more from China, that the deal wasn't tough enough. And that would be a political non-starter for President Xi, who's facing his own political constraints at home, who's concerned about critics on his nationalist flank who are going to accuse him of selling out. So the last thing he wants is to be put in a situation where Trump seems to be jerking him around and demanding more after a deal appeared to be settled.
Gabriel, it seems very strange. I mean, it seemed, when you consider the timing of all these recent actions involving the blacklist and involving the visa restrictions, why now? And it just smacks off a massive unforced error here, because he's ticked off the Chinese at a very sensitive and a critical juncture in the trade talks. It's almost inevitable that they're going to walk away.
Well, I think the Xinjiang restrictions that we saw this week was the nail in the coffin for any prospect that there could be a deal announced after the current round of talks. But in the medium term, I'm a little bit more optimistic, because I think the Chinese are very used to, at this point, 30 years after Tiananmen Square, are very used to absorbing U.S. criticism on human rights. But they've shown a willingness over the years to compartmentalize that anger, the anger against that criticism, and to prioritize important economic issues and important economic relationships with the U.S. and other big economies. So while the sanctions in the short term doomed any prospect for a deal this week, I think that if the U.S. politics are favorable for a deal, that these Xinjiang sanctions will not be the factor that scuttles that deal. These companies that were sanctioned this week, they're important, but they're not nearly as important as a company like Huawei. Huawei, that issue has got to be resolved for there to be any kind of trade agreement. The entity list restriction against Huawei has to be at least softened. I'm not sure that these other, although they are important companies, that these other companies are the true national champions that Huawei is, and that therefore that China would be determined to make that a requirement for them to reach a deal.
Net, Gabriel, where does it leave the tariff regime and what happens on October the 15th and then moving forward, December the 15th? Are those tariffs going to be waived, or are they going to be in place still?
I think the October tariffs will go into effect. I think there's a decent chance that there could be some kind of minor climb down that produces at least a delay in the December tariffs. But looking ahead, looking ahead beyond that, I'm a bit more optimistic, I think, than consensus that U.S. election politics will eventually lead to at least some kind of partial deal to remove some tariffs before the U.S. election, because the slowdown in the U.S. economy and the pressure on Trump to produce some kind of deliverable for all the turmoil that he's put the economy through with these tariffs. As the election approaches, I expect that he will feel some pressure to deliver something. Of course, that deal won't satisfy hardline critics in the U.S. who will say it's too soft, but the markets may feel some relief.
I'm really glad you brought in the US election dynamic, and it's very clear that an aggressive trade posture seems to be a bipartisan position. So if we do see President Elizabeth Warren, will she be as tough, if not tougher, than President Trump on China and calling them out? Or will the calculus be different?
It's very interesting to see how the Democrats have tried to position themselves on this issue vis-a-vis the president. So we saw at the last debate that they all searched for ways to draw contrast between themselves and President Trump. They criticized his tactics. They highlighted the pain that tariffs have caused. But when push came to shove, they weren't willing to say that they were going to lift tariffs. But I believe as the election approaches, let alone if there is a Warren administration or a Democrat in the White House, that they will take a slightly more conciliatory line, because Trump is a unique political figure in terms of his love for tariffs. He's telling the truth when he says tariffs are good. And I think the Democrats, while they recognize the need to confront China on some of these important issues, they are more sensitive to the political backlash and to the real pain to the U.S. economy, to both consumers and businesses. So I think at this point in the election cycle, Democrats still feel pressure to posture tough against China, and that makes them unwilling to call for an end to tariffs. But if they actually took office, I believe we would see a more conciliatory approach.
Great perspective. Gabriel, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Gabriel Wildau there of Teneo Risk Advisory.